This is the support film for the AS. Essay, was the Korean War a US or a UN conflict? You are to use this as either exemplar or in conjunction with your marking top sheet. So in the introduction, what we are looking for here will be context, plan, and argument. Set the scene, how you're going to write the essay, what's the case you're going to be arguing. Despite obvious confusion, the Korean War of 1950 to 53 was a war fought by the USA and her allies under the flag of the UN. Here is the context. The legalities aside, the UN was implementing US foreign policy and that of her allies, making the police action a de facto US war, though for the sake of international law, there was a de jure UN-approved conflict. So the argument is clear that it's a de facto US war, but it's a de jure UN war. Right from the partition of Korea in 1945, the UN and its members had agreed to the UN overseeing the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. At this point, any action carried out during the war could be argued as legally the actions of the UN, fulfilling this original brief that the UN had. I will argue, however, that the UN is only an organisation that can act on the principles of its members, and centrally its most powerful member or members, which in this case is the United States, therefore it is a US war. Following the 1947 Truman Doctrine, US foreign policy was committed to containing the spread of communism. Despite failing to anticipate the conflict, this was why the US responded in the way they did upon North Korea's invasion of the South in 1950. Central to my argument is that the US unilaterally committed themselves to intervention upon Kim's invasion. Truman dispatched troops from Japan immediately before any consultation with the UN, showing that the US would fulfill its obligations under the Truman Doctrine. Only after initial orders did Truman contact the UN, though. The UN in the 1950s was an organisation charged with maintaining the peace of the world and containing any conflicts that broke out. Following on from its creation, its prestige was high. All member nations were committed to honour its principles, and there having been no major conflict since 1945, felt duty-bound to work within its structures and frameworks. It was, however, an organisation founded upon democratic and principles of self-determination. It was never going to be an organisation that would support the flagrant use of force, especially by a dictatorship. With the odds stacked against the communist powers and issues being compounded over Communist China's lack of recognition as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it is unsurprising that the USSR was refusing to participate in the UN at the time of the invasion. This point illustrates the war as being that of the US, as it's simply a reflection of the reality of the UN. It was an organisation set above the power of individual countries, but essentially reflecting the realities of power. The US was the foremost member of the UN, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and a founding member. The UN cannot initiate policy as it is at the service of its members. Without the Soviet veto, the UN became the instrument of the US and its allies. Once sanctioning the UN, or US-dominated intervention, after the US unilateral action had already taken place, the UN would agree to all other actions initiated by the US. US troops were authorized, US leadership was approved under the command of MacArthur. The principal forces involved were American, and despite the de jure UN flag flying above the armies, the chain of command ran from MacArthur to Truman in Washington, not the UN in New York, once again stressing the US domination of the war. The decision to go north of the 38th parallel was initiated from Washington and driven as much by US foreign policy, the Truman Doctrine, and as a consequence of domestic pressures, with Truman being on the back foot due to McCarthy and his second Red Scare. With an election looming and the Democrats attempting to keep the Republicans out of office, as they had done since 1933, the desires of the UN, who have no standing armies or resources, strike me as an irrelevance. The UN is only the sum of its parts, and the only one that mattered in 1950 was the United States, with the Soviet Union obviously abstaining. All other key members were either US allies or the Soviets, who were abstaining from the UN altogether. At each stage, the UN was used to rubber stamp US foreign policy, which at no stage had ever supported values contrary to its founding and most important member. It was therefore legally a de jure UN war. With the absence of the Soviets, the UN would naturally follow the desires of its democratic powers, and this therefore de facto made the UN an instrument of the US and its allies.